Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jo Handelsman. She's the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. She's a professor in the Department of Plant Pathology. She's going to be talking with us about soil, a precious resource under threat. And now I'm going to ask Jo a series of questions. Jo, where were you born?
New York City.
And where did you go to college, undergrad?
Cornell in agronomy. I was telling Tom I learned to drive a combine before I learned to drive a car.
And where'd you go for your PhD?
Madison, Wisconsin, molecular biology.
And then where'd you go?
Then I joined the faculty. I was a postdoc, joined the faculty at Madison in plant pathology. And then in 2010, I went to Yale. Then I was invited to go to the White House to be an advisor to President Obama. I spent 3 years there, the last 3 years of his administration. And then I came back to Madison.
She's going to be talking to us tonight about, not the D word. Go ahead, say it. No, he didn't. He was baiting her before. This is a pretty cool thing. I got my start in science with my ag school, my high school ag teacher, getting to go to farm shows and farm tech shows, and I never took a course in soil, but if you're going to grow plants, it's a good idea to know something about soil, and it's a great pleasure to have Jo speak to us on soil, a precious resource under threat. Please join me in welcoming Jo Handelsman to Wednesday Night Live.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks, everybody, for being here. Hopefully, I won't be giving this talk again in 20 years and having to explain to people what soil is. That's my hope, and you'll understand that hope by the time I'm done tonight. So I'd like to tell you about 3 things tonight. First of all, why we care about soil, what it does, what it is, and why it matters to us. And then secondly, what this crisis that I mentioned in my title is. Why is this a diminishing resource, and why is that a problem? And then end with some thoughts on what we can do to protect our soil and what we have already done. So soil's familiar to all of us. We live in Wisconsin. This is a pretty familiar site. It looks pretty innocuous, a nice plowed field. I love the look of a field like that, but I have learned to despise a look like that because plowing is one of the worst things you can do to soil. And it's the one thing I disagree with Thomas Jefferson on, one of a few, because he said that the greatest invention of humankind was the moldboard plow, and he couldn't have been more wrong, because it is probably the plow that has destroyed more civilizations than any other implement. We see soil in lots of different settings. It's the basis of all sorts of human activity. We see piles of it on roadsides, but very few of us actually dig down into it and learn something a little bit more intimate about it. These are 5 soil profiles that gives you the sense of the tremendous diversity of soils and what they look like. And that's just at the macro level that you can see with your eye. Of course, when you look very closely or at a molecular level, it's even more varied. So soil is, we talk about it all the time, but very few people will actually define it. It's a heterogeneous mixture, so it's not a uniform thing, and it's a mixture containing weathered rock and pulverized all sorts of geologic material that's down to very small size particles like sand, silt, and clay, and those are shown here. They're differentiated based largely on their size, but also on their chemistry. And then, of course, there's a living component, the so-called organic component of soil. And that is a mixture of both living and dead plants, animals, and microorganisms. And it's in a constant dynamic state of change because the decomposition occurs to all of the dying or dead organisms. And so this is a continuous process, and you have the release of nutrients from those dead organisms, the release of nutrients from live organisms. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And you have a constant influx of water and outflux of water, influx of air. There are many pockets that are filled either with water or air and soil, and that's constantly changing. It's either getting wetted or it's drying. Microorganisms are the dominant organisms in soil, and they're tremendously diverse. Soil is the most diverse environment on Earth, containing somewhere between 4,000 and 40,000 bacterial species per gram, and that's how little we know about soil, that we can't get very much closer than that kind of broad range of estimates. The numbers are pretty staggering. In a gram of soil, which is maybe part of a teaspoon, you have 1 billion individual bacterial cells. And of course, those represent these thousands of species. And the bacteria are quite varied in their morphological typical morphologies, and then when you grow them, if you can, in a cultured petri dish in the lab, you see an entirely new portrait of the bacteria, because of course their microscopic identifications don't look like their behaviors on petri dishes. We also have eukaryotes, or higher organisms in soil, but that are still microscopic, fungi and protists and nematodes, as well as viruses that infect all of the above, plus plants and bacteria. So this is the broad range of morphological types of organisms. And historically, there's been a real affection for soil that I think we've lost today. If you look back over religions in the history of humankind, there may not have been an appreciation of all the things I just showed you, all the different microscopic organisms or the chemicals in soil, but there certainly was an appreciation of the importance of soil and the power of soil. And one of the lines of evidence that supports that is if you look back at just about every religion, there is a very high deity. This is Eartha from Germanic religions. There's a Native American deity. All of these religions have very, very high deity, which is almost always a female deity and represents soil. And that's an indication that ancient people and more recent people had an appreciation of soil. But I don't think we have that today. And as people who live, most of us in cities or suburban areas, soil may be something we occasionally garden, but it's not something that we think about every day of our lives. I was struck when I was looking at the religious connections with soil that I couldn't at first find anything in the Judeo-Christian tradition that indicated some deep spiritual connection with soil. And then I read a book called Soil, the Ecstatic Skin of the Earth, a little overstated, but I like it. And they had a great quote in that book, the Lord hath created medicines out of the earth, and he that is wise will not abhor them, from Ecclesiastes. So I guess the Bible certainly does recognize the importance of soil, and presumably those medicines are what we know today as antibiotics. And then it was pointed out to me by my father that I was missing a pretty important part, and that was Adam, whose name in Hebrew, pronounced Adam, means soil. So I was really ignorant that the Judeo-Christian tradition had soil pretty prominently placed in its beginnings. So why did all these societies care so much about soil and revere soil and honor it in the ways that they did? Well, the most obvious one that probably most people would say first is that it provides us with food security. And certainly the production of food, whether it's on Earth or in this case on Mars, mythical Mars, it's critical to have the substrate of soil to produce food. We don't know how to produce the staple crops in any other way. We can do some specialty crops in hydroponic or other settings, but to grow our row crops, our typical staples of wheat and rice and corn, the only way in this day and age is in soil. But soil has a lot of other roles. One important one is in mitigating climate change or maintaining, in the past, the balance of carbon in the environment. So the soil on Earth, just the top meter of soil, contains 1,300 to 1,600 gigatons of organic carbon. That's a vast amount of carbon. It's a little hard to conceptualize. So another way to think of it is that the soil on Earth contains twice the amount of carbon that we have in the entire atmosphere of the Earth, the gaseous phase above the surface of the Earth, and 3 times the amount of carbon in all the plants, trees, forests, and living green matter on Earth. So it is an enormous repository for carbon, and therefore it's important to keep that carbon in the soil, because if it goes out of the soil, it's usually as methane or carbon dioxide and it causes more greenhouse gas accumulation and therefore more warming. But it's also potentially one of the biggest sinks we have for carbon, and that's been proposed as one of the ways that we could be combating climate change, is to increase the carbon in soil by just a tiny percentage, which would have a vast impact on carbon in the atmosphere. We also know that water quality and its availability is dependent entirely on soil. In fact, soil is the biggest water filter on Earth, and we wouldn't be able to drink groundwater, where many of us get our water today, if it weren't for soil. When you think of the contaminants in water at the surface of the soil, and then what we drink that comes out of our faucets, there's a pretty big difference there. And that difference is due to the filtering that soil does. And that's a combination of physical and chemical filtering as well as biological filtering through the organisms that live in the soil. Because of its tremendous biological diversity, soil is also the home of probably more organisms on Earth than any other part of the biosphere. And that biodiversity is a tremendous source of potential drugs and enzymes and biotechnology reagents and many other things that we use microbes for in many settings. And among those, perhaps the most important one historically has been the use of soil organisms for antibiotics. And traditionally, most of our antibiotics have come from soil bacteria. About 3/4 of those that we use today in medicine were derived from soil bacteria, and the soil offers a continued resource that we should be taking advantage of to deal with the antibiotic crisis. But I'm not going to talk about that today. But the problem is that not all soils are healthy, and more of our soils are becoming unhealthy. So you've probably seen images like this from various parts of the world. Africa and India have been the site of several real disasters with soil due to droughts. But there are also many soils in more temperate environments in the United States, in Europe, all over the world, where the soil has been grossly eroded, and we no longer have the soil in these environments that we used to have. Soil health is the phrase used to broadly describe the utility of the soil, whether it has a high carbon content, whether it has nutrients, whether it has a water holding capacity, whether it has the ability to support plants. And those processes are driven largely by the biological parts of soil, namely the microorganisms and the plants. Many soils are devoid of plants for part of the year. I'll come back to that in a minute. But in a soil like this, where you see there's a slope, without plants present, the soil can be washed away quite readily. And so water can erode soil, in this case, in the further west and to some degree south of us, wind erosion is very important for removing soil from where it normally lies. So unhealthy soil is more likely to erode. It's harder to keep in place because the biological material and the carbon, the organic carbon and the plant material is what holds soil in place. So unhealthy soil is unhealthy, and that's a problem for many reasons, but soil erosion is one of the biggest ones. So that's one of the problems with soil today, is our soil is eroding. This is a picture from Iowa, a flyover capture that if you can see the light spots in these fields, all of these kind of whitish or tannish areas, those are areas where there is no more topsoil. So Iowa should look as dark brown and beautiful and rich as Wisconsin. You can see areas like that. That's the typical look of an Iowa soil. And those light areas indicate that the topsoil has been completely stripped off and they're down to subsoil and bedrock. And that is an environment in which plants cannot grow. The national average soil erosion, based on U.S. Department of Agriculture numbers, is about 5 tons per acre per year. And those are from the last few years of statistics from the USDA. But in Iowa, it's been calculated that acreage of pretty substantial expanses, hundreds of thousands of acres, are eroding at 25 to 50 tons per acre per year. That rate is increasing due to changing weather patterns, and I'll explain that in a minute. And in a couple of years of really bad weather events, areas of Iowa were measured to suffer losses of 100 tons per acre per year in one afternoon. And so while this 100 tons per acre per year is a frightening number compared to our average of 5 tons per acre per year, the idea of it being lost due to one rainstorm is mind-boggling and quite frightening. So erosion is a problem for us, partly because we need the soil where it is for growing our crops, but it's also a problem where the soil goes. So this is the mouth of the Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico. And what happens when some of the soil that leaves the land in Iowa, Wisconsin, Missouri, all along the river, gets washed into the river and then eventually is deposited in the Gulf of Mexico. Phosphorus can be released from soil particles that have been transported down the river, and when those are released in the Gulf, they cause algae blooms. We're very familiar with those here in Wisconsin, but it happens at an enormous scale in the Gulf of Mexico. Then when those algae decay, the oxygen, the decay process, sucks up the oxygen from the Gulf, and the Gulf goes hypoxic or oxygen-free. That has been devastating across the entire Gulf of Mexico to the shellfish and other industries because this zone here is 7,900 square miles. That's the size of New Jersey. So that is a substantial part of the Gulf of Mexico that in many years is devoid of animal life because of the hypoxic behavior. Soil health problems are not new. We've been seeing them throughout human history since the beginning of agriculture, but particularly since the beginning of the use of the plow. And this was well recognized in the early part of the 20th century, right after the Dust Bowl. So this is something that most of us learned about only through reading Grapes of Wrath in high school, but it was a real phenomenon where vast amounts of soil were transported off the land by wind. So this is a case where it's not water erosion, but it's wind erosion. Removed that soil and took it to other places in the country. This had a devastating effect on the area affected by the Dust Bowl of Kansas and Oklahoma and areas like that. And soon after that, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, he signed legislation that created a new service at the United States Department of Agriculture called the Soil Conservation Service. And that act was not one of his most famous ones, but certainly one of his most important ones in his presidency. The Soil Conservation Service lasted for many decades and then eventually became what we know of today as the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and it has soil folded in. They have done some very good work on reducing erosion. So these are numbers of erosion, billions of tons of soil eroded by year across the United States. And you can see that they got some really nice effects of certain farming practices that prevented erosion. You might note the year here, 1982 and 1985, were 2 years when additional legislation that supplemented what FDR signed was developed, the food security legislation that mandated that USDA monitor soil conservation practices. And so you can see the impact of that legislation dropping probably by about a third the overall erosion rates. And that would have continued, except in 1992, another farm bill was passed, and then 5 years after that, another one, which both gutted the Soil or the Food Security Act and took away USDA's resources in order that they used to hold farmers accountable for their soil practices. As soon as you don't hold people accountable, of course, things will slip, and you can see that there's been a pretty much leveling off, and in more recent years, a small rise in soil erosion rates. This erosion rate is simply not sustainable, whether we're talking the very high levels before the Food Security Act or these later ones, which are less but not low enough. We know that the average rate across the United States is about 5 tons per acre, and if we take, say, your average Iowa soil, where there are about 1,000 tons per acre of topsoil on a really rich Iowa farm, you can see that if we were eroding at 5 tons per acre, that's just simply not sustainable. Soil is made at about 1/10 or maybe even 1/50th of that rate. So the equation doesn't work. We're eroding much faster than soil is being produced. But you might say this is kind of good news, because even by 2120, about 100 years from now, you can see we would only be down to about half the topsoil that we started with. That already is a problem, because once the soil gets to about 50% of its original depth, that's when crop yields begin to drop. And we've already begun to see that in areas of the Midwest, in Ohio and Iowa. Even when there is some soil left, it often is not sufficient. So in 100 years at this rate, we would start to see a problem developing. But that's not the whole story. If we were eroding at much higher rates, like 25, 50, or 100 tons per acre, you would see the same fields be devoid of topsoil by, say, 2030 or 2040, or at the latest 2060 if we were at the lower end of 25 tons per acre. That may sound theoretical, but when we see one year eroding fields at 100 tons per acre, this graph here is not very unlikely. It seems like it is likely to occur in the next decade or two over large tracts of Midwestern land. So that's a pretty frightening prospect. If all of our land were eroding at this rate, we would have no soil by 2030. Now, obviously, not all of it is eroding at that rate, so that's hopefully not going to occur. But large amounts of our land are eroding at that rate, and that is simply not sustainable and simply won't be able to support agriculture in the next few decades. That's still not the whole story because it's getting worse. Those rates are likely to increase over the next decades. The reason that we know that is looking at trends in the very heavy precipitation events that occur, particularly in the Midwest. And so the number of heavy precipitation events per year clustered around an average for the first half of the 20th century. And you can see sometimes they were above and sometimes below the average, but on average, it was an acceptable level that we were used to dealing with. But since the 1950s, we've seen a steady rise in the frequency of these heavy precipitation events, and it is these events that are so powerful as soil eroding events. And the reason is that the velocity of the raindrops that come down to Earth from these precipitation events is high enough to destroy soil structure or the architecture of the soil. When you destroy the structure, then you're down to small grains and particles, and the soil is more likely to wash away. And so soil that has been impacted by these heavy rain events is more likely to erode and does erode. So as these numbers of events increase, and I think we've all seen them in the Midwest in the last few years, they are not unusual events, but very frequent now. As this increases, we will see the average across the US of 5 tons per acre per year probably being left behind in the dust, so to speak, and will be approaching averages much greater than that, suggesting that some of these very rapid erosion rates are quite reasonable for large tracts of land. And of course, it depends on how the land has been managed, it depends on the slope of the land, and it depends on the weather that that particular area is subject to. But what the average of 5 tons per acre covers up and makes almost invisible to us is that even when the average is 5 tons per acre per year, there is still soil eroding at 100 tons per acre per year, and that amount is increasing. So I have a particular objection to this as a soil scientist and someone who loves soils, but I think anyone who lives in the Midwest and appreciates those rich, deep, fertile, dark brown soils should have a particular objection to the rate at which we're eroding. We have a gift in the Midwest of the United States called the mollisol. This is a very unusual soil. It is the most fertile soil on Earth. Of all the types of soil, it stands out as supporting crop productivity like no other. And there are only a few countries in the world that have been gifted with the mollisol, and those are the Midwestern United States, the Ukraine, the very black soil of the Ukraine that has been fought over for decades, and there are arguments that the Ukraine keeps getting invaded because of the value of its soil, a small area of northeastern China, and a small region in Argentina. Those are the only places that you find these precious mollisols on Earth. And here we have one of the largest tracts of mollisols in the Midwest here, and we are eroding them to the point that the mollisol may become extinct or close to it in the next few decades. So I think that squandering this resource is not our right as stewards of the earth, that this is a critical resource not just for us, but for the sustenance of our planet from a climate perspective, as well as sustaining our forests and many other aspects of the earth. So when I was in the White House, I wondered, what can we do about this? How can we either build our mollisols or protect them from further erosion? And so I installed a committee that included representatives of 15 different agencies across the federal government who were all interested in soils. And I chartered this committee with the responsibility of planning a future, developing a plan for soil. I was appalled to find out that most countries in the world have very good strategic plans for soil, and the United States does not have one. It was close enough to the end of the administration that they developed at this point, which was just before we left office, a framework for a federal strategic plan for soil science. And it's a great report. It needs to be developed and enacted, but it tells us a little bit about what we can do to protect our soils. And I never got the chance, actually, to send a memo to President Obama about soil, but I did sneak in the Oval Office one day and have a chat with him about it, so he does know about soil. Some of the actions that were recommended in this report were, first of all, to promote interdisciplinary research and education. One of the reasons I came back to Wisconsin was to direct the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, which I hope to make an iconic place for interdisciplinary research, because not only soil but many other fields of science their futures will depend on interdisciplinarity. Another thing that the committee identified were computational tools and good modeling tools to be able to predict the fate of our soils. And finally, to expand the use of sustainable agricultural practices, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what those mean. And before I do, we need to digress to talk about how carbon ends up in soil. So there's a process called Raizo Deposition, which is basically the route of carbon dioxide from the air into the soil. So we know that the sun provides the energy for photosynthesis, and plants carry on photosynthesis, which is the fixation of carbon dioxide into sugars and other organic molecules. Plants will then transport a large proportion of the carbon that they fix. In fact, a third of what they fix ends up in the roots, and a large portion of that ends up outside the roots and is deposited in soil. So plants are not wasteful. They've been evolving for a very long time, and they have evolved to be efficient. So why would they go to all the trouble of fixing all this carbon and then dumping it into the area around their roots? And the answer is that they are then feeding the microorganisms that live in association with those plants with carbon and nitrogen and various other nutrients that they need. The microbes will then proliferate on those roots. And interestingly, one of the products that they produce are polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are long chains of sugars, so they're very sticky molecules that bacteria produce. And these are the molecules that stick soil particles together. So soil gets its architecture, its structure, from the polysaccharides produced by bacteria. And that structure, as we talked about before, is absolutely critical for maintaining soil in place and not eroding it under rain conditions. So that suggests to us that one of the approaches you might imagine to improving soil health and reducing erosion would be to get more polysaccharide produced in the area around the roots by those bacteria. That would in turn require more carbon to be exported into the rhizosphere or into the soil. That would require plants probably to fix more carbon and transport more to their roots. That's one concept that we're exploring at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery with an interdisciplinary team that looks at the movement of carbon through plants, the breeding of plants and genetics of plants that may affect what happens to that carbon, and then with soil microbiologists who will look at the efficiency with which the bacteria convert carbon from the plant into polysaccharides. Another approach that is, I think, extremely promising was developed right next door to us in Iowa, and this is called prairie strips, and this is based on the observation and the knowledge that our fantastic mollisols were developed because of the prairie plants that lived in them for decades before we started farming this part of the world. Those prairie plants have deep roots. They're perennial plants, so they put a lot of their energy into their roots in storing energy from year to year, rather than a plant like a corn plant, which is an annual plant, where it shuttles all of its energy into that ear of corn, and then the plant dies. And so the result is that corn will suck the carbon and nutrients out of the soil, put all of the stores into the ear, whereas these prairie plants will take all of their nutrients and before the end of the growing season, transport them down to the roots where they get stored. Well, a lot of that material doesn't just stay in the roots, but it also exudes out into the soil where it's broken down, and that generates more soil through microbial activity. And that's one of the ways that plants foster the production of soil. So this program in Iowa called STRIPS is a simple process of taking about 10% of their corn out of production and replacing that corn with deep-rooted prairie plants. And when they did that, they found that they can reduce runoff, which is the water that is in the fields that moves out of the fields and often will carry very destructive nutrients. They could reduce the runoff by 37%, but even more impressive, they could reduce erosion by 90 to 95%. So if we went to all strip planting in all of our corn across the Midwest, we could reduce erosion by about more than 90% in 1 year. And that would probably reduce the erosion even more in subsequent years because this carbon builds up in the soil and the soil architecture becomes even stronger and is held together by more polysaccharides over time. So this is an incredibly simple and inexpensive route to preserving our soil. Doesn't disrupt the economy in terms of the farmers producing corn, which is their greatest, financially greatest commodity. But it will have a great effect on the erosion of soil. And we can talk later about some of the barriers to that. Sounds simple, but nothing is that simple in agriculture. So the practices that were identified in this report and that are well known in any group of farmers or agronomists are moving to no-till planting. As I said at the beginning, plowing is one of the most destructive things one can do to soil because it breaks down the structure, just like those high-velocity raindrops do, and that destroys the total architecture of the soil and leads to erosion. There's some evidence that societies that have plowed have lasted about 250 years, and then they begin to collapse. And there's actually a pretty regular beat if you look across many different kinds of societies. Well, we're at about 250 years, so not sure where that leaves us, but it can't be good. So no-till planting method developed in the United States, but still only represents 25 to 30% of the crop acreage in the United States. In a place like Brazil, it represents 75% of their acreage. So what's wrong with us that we can't go to more no-till? Intercropping. Intercropping, like what I showed you on the previous slide, the strip crops, is another relatively simple and relatively inexpensive method to intersperse corn with prairie plants, and they add enormous amounts of carbon to the soil, give the soil structure, and prevent erosion. And then finally, cover cropping. About 8 months of the year, if you fly over most parts of the Midwest, you can see bare soil. So from the time that farmers harvest in the fall to the time they plant the following spring, there's usually open soil that often has been plowed. And so this flyover picture shows you a typical soil, typical area of Iowa where the soil has been left open for the entire time between harvest and planting. That makes the soil very vulnerable, and unless there are lots of bacteria, polysaccharides, and plant material that are holding it together, it makes it, of course, vulnerable to erosion. This is a picture at a microscopic level of the polysaccharides that bacteria can produce. So these little strands you see here are examples of these long, sticky polymers that stick the soil particles together, giving it its architecture. Most of us have actually seen this if you've ever been to the beach and you see those sort of sheets of sand after the tide goes out. You can kind of begin to see the sand hold together, and you almost think you can pick it up as a single piece. That is the work of these bacteria. They grow very rapidly as the tide goes out. They produce polysaccharides. Those hold the sand particles together, and that gives you that superstructure. And that is just one example, but of course in soil, it's a much more intricate network than you see in sand. So we've been thinking quite a lot about this across the street at WID. What can we do to change the way the United States treats its soils? And I think that after being in Washington for 3 years, we probably can't count on a legislative solution or a policy change. And that I was in a very friendly administration for science and agriculture and for making change, and I could not get policy changes that would accomplish some of the things that I've described to you here. So I think that ultimately it's up to consumers and the public to make this happen. But before that happens, we have to tell the public and make sure the public understands what's happening. Because most people, when they hear about soil erosion, their first question is, why didn't I know about this? This is as serious a problem in many ways as climate change. We hear about climate change probably pretty much every day. But when was the last time anybody in this room heard about soil erosion? Today? Yesterday? In the last month? Last year? Anyone? One, two.
Last year.
Last year, okay. So,
Last week.
last week, all right. So we have a few who have heard about this, but not a lot. And remember, this audience, of course, is not representative of all of the American public. So it's even worse when you get outside a university campus. So how do we inform the public? And so we're doing some experiments to look at different routes to informing the public in Wisconsin and see what are the effective ways, but just a few examples. So I'm working on a nonfiction book. My husband is working on a novel called Ground Wars, which is about a science advisor to the president who happens to believe that soil is threatened and she can't get to first base with anybody in government. And there's nothing autobiographical about it. But he felt like he lived through that period of my life, so he felt comfortable writing it. We have a film producer who's interested in making a feature film, probably for Netflix, on the concept of this dilemma. And then I think when we get the public on board, one of the longer-term goals is to develop what we call a soil-safe label. And that's like labeling your food organic. That if food, and I think the best target for this is meat, because the worst soil offenders are corn and soybean, and those are used to produce meat. If, for example, meat was labeled soil-safe, and charged just a very small premium because that meat had been produced in a soil-safe manner, that could help farmers get over the hump of making those changes that will always, any kind of change in agriculture will cost farmers money at the beginning, but because building soil health ultimately pays for itself, this would then take over and probably pay for itself through savings in fertilizers and other things. Walmart has a very strong sustainability commitment, and they sell 25% of the food in the United States. So we think that if we would just get Walmart on board, that might be enough to tip the scales and make the soil-safe label something very well known in American food consumption. And we plan to have a blitz of public information, so we really inform the public broadly about soil. And we're also developing a high school curriculum. We have a proposed study with Dietram Scheufele from the Life Sciences Communication Department, studying whether kids are better ambassadors than adults in changing attitudes. And there was a very interesting study several years ago that showed that when kids are involved in mock voting, the rates of voting in their communities go way up, of real voting. So they're clearly having an impact on their parents. There were, I think, similar results with smoking, that children can be very powerful forces to stop their parents from smoking. So we're hoping that this high school curriculum will not only educate the children, but the parents of those kids as well. FDR said when he passed that legislation, it needed to be ratified by all the states. He wrote a wonderful letter to all the governors in the United States and urged them to ratify this legislation to create the Soil Conservation Service. And in that letter, he said the nation that destroys its soil destroys itself, which has become something of a mantra for those who are concerned about soil. There is ample evidence from history that this is true. He certainly did know his history. And there are many, many examples throughout history, from Easter Island to possibly the Roman Empire, where societies have plowed and plowed and plowed their soil. They have then destroyed its structure, it's been washed away, and they can't produce food, and their populations suffer. So I think that not only a nation can destroy itself, but we need to worry about our planet destroying itself if we strip our soil from the surface. With that, I thank you for your attention and be happy to take questions. Yes?
When I grew up in southern Indiana, and we had agriculture courses from grade school through, well, middle school through high school. And one of they always talk about plowing, so that was a given back in the 50s and 60s. But when did the process of monocrops, and back in when I was growing up, the idea of rotating crops was forced. That was part of the theory about how to preserve the soil, et cetera. When did that stop? And why did it stop in going to a monocrop, which actually just rapes the soil of nutrients?
Well, we still do crop rotation, but in the Midwest, it tends to be a corn-soybean rotation, and both of those plants suck a lot of nutrients and carbon out of the soil and destroy its structure. So although rotations are still popular, they're not actually really healthy rotations. What we need in there are rotations with perennial plants like alfalfa or the prairie plants that will deposit more carbon than they remove.
How are you getting your message out to like the School of Agriculture here for dairy, or how do you get it in this state to farmers, both dairy and vegetable farmers, like in the Central Saints, and then how do you get it to the governor into the state?
All good questions. I haven't figured out why the message hasn't gotten out there, because I have yet to meet a soil scientist who I say something like this to and doesn't say, yeah, right, we're losing our soil. It's common knowledge. And that's common to some degree across the College of Agriculture, to more or less degrees in different departments, different areas. But then you move outside and somehow the education hasn't penetrated society. So one of the things that we're working on is a collaboration potentially with 4-H to get the word out through extension and then into the schools. And then using every route we have for communication, which of course today means social media, the internet, books, magazines, newspapers, talks, science pubs, whatever you can imagine. So once we have the materials developed to be able to do that, we hope to develop kind of an army of people to go out and communicate this. Yes?
I wonder for interdisciplinary science communication if you use anticipatory life cycle assessment and use that as a tool to discuss your science with other scientists not in your area of expertise.
It's a really interesting point. One of the things we work on in WID is learning the skills of communication to our near peers, people in our fields, people in the public who may not know much science at all, but very importantly to people in other fields of science. And I think that's one of the neglected areas in science communication, that scientists just assume that other scientists in other fields will understand their jargon, and in fact that's not true. So we have started developing courses on communication to all people of all different levels of knowledge of your field, and I'm hoping that that will be kind of the basis for moving forward with that kind of conversation. It's a really great point. Yeah?
But have you used the economics, gene counting, and life cycle assessment to add to that communication?
No, we've just worked with life science communicators, but you're absolutely right. There are good models that we should be using in economics. Very good point. Yeah?
You mentioned labels as a way to sort of indicate what products are using safe practices, which ones aren't. Do you think this would run into a similar problem that organic labels run into, whereas some labels are labeled as organic, but when you sort of go behind and see what those methods were, they're not really that organic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's always a risk with labels. It's also a risk with things like CRP or land put into ecological programs that aren't monitors, right? So that's what happened with the USDA is they have the same programs they always had, but once their budgets were cut, they could no longer go and certify in person. So farmers now can certify their own land and say that they're using good practices to protect the soil. So absolutely, certification has to be coupled with some sort of either inspection or certification process, and that's definitely to be worked out. What we'd like to do is get a coalition of farmers and consumers and environmental groups and people from government and hopefully some large food retailers to work together. And we started this in the White House, and it was actually a very exciting process to hear these people with very disparate perspectives all having the same goal, that they all knew that their livelihood wasn't going to be sustainable if we didn't protect the soil, no matter what aspect of the agricultural system they took part in. So that's something I think we would need to develop as a community, absolutely. Yes?
So I might be laboring under a misconception, but as far as I can see, isn't there a lot of subsidization of agriculture in this state, aka the farm bill, the insurance that people get whenever their soybean beans fail or whatever? Don't you make this contingent that they have a 10% allocation, that they actually preserve their coverage under this kind of fish out mechanism?
You're absolutely right, and ironically, it was crop insurance that blocked what I wanted to get done when I was in the White House. The problem there is that if a farmer takes, so I wanted to institute the strip farming, which is almost fail-safe in terms of protecting the soil. If a farmer takes 10% of their corn out of production and replaces it with prairie plants, they get 10% less crop insurance because their crop insurance is based on the number of acres of corn from last year. Farmers can't afford that. Farming is, working at the margins, and so that 10% is essentially an impossible risk to take for farmers. So we thought, well, we're the federal government. We should be able to change the rules of crop insurance. No. That's all I'll tell you. No. And that's exactly why I feel like we need a different approach, because getting changes through the Department of Agriculture and through the banks and the federal bank collaboration, I think would be doomed. But you're absolutely right. We have great levers. The question is, how do we get people to use them? Yes?
So, one thing, I've been interested in agriculture for years, but I'm not conventional, and it's all self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
I went to school for business, and
Mhm.
And I like your stripping idea, but I mean, you're still gonna have pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides
Mhm.
that are sprayed right next to the strips.
Right.
I mean, so that's still gonna impact and have, I mean, you're gonna have pesticide drift, you're gonna have, et cetera. So, but my main question would be how you, I mean, given funding and people are strapped economically as it is, even though we're having, I mean, I don't know, some more than others, I won't get into politics more than we already are, but like, how does somebody like that get funding that wants to do more beneficial methods, whether it's regenerative, biointensive, biodynamic, organic, whatever?
Well, starting out farmers are the best ones to target with these techniques, because it's once farmers have investments in particularly the capital expenses, like the large equipment for plowing, for example, that it becomes financially very challenging for them to change their practices. So the best time to convince a farmer to implement some of the practices we talked about is at the beginning. The USDA has programs to get new people, young people, into farming and ranching. They're actually pretty substantial programs, and they will pay people, support them to buy land or rent land, and then get going in farming. Those would be perfect programs to target with some of these practices that would be beneficial to the soil. But USDA is not doing that as far as I know. I may be wrong about that, but last time I looked.
I've looked up like extensively into like the SAR program, for example,
Mhm.
and like things like that, they unfortunately still don't cater towards somebody like me that doesn't have applicable experience. I mean, I've worked for CSAs and I've seen organic farms in much of this country, and like especially West Coast to Midwest oriented, not the East Coast. And I mean, I feel like I'm just gonna have to invest in myself, but at that level, what level of difference are you doing? I mean, already 1% of our farms are organic, 99% still are not. And so if we switch to something like labeling our farms and having more soil safe labels, I mean, if we still have 99% that's untouched, how does the populace get somebody like me, and I want many of me, I want all of you to be growing food, like literally. I mean, but that's the difference between farming by hand versus farming by machinery. Like you say, once you have all machinery, which I don't, I have no machinery. Like I don't want any machinery in many ways for the type of farming that I'm wanting to do. But there again, how do you, I mean, should I just go home tonight and make a GoFundMe? Like, I'm serious. Like,
Well, I still think the USDA programs are a start. If you have a plan, they certainly will consider you no matter whether you have a farming background or not. In fact, the whole point is to get new people into the farming industry because they're concerned about the number of farmers among the young population. I think the idea of the soil safe label is intended to be an economic incentive, that if there's a premium on food that's been grown in a soil safe way, and this is a big if we can get that extra profit to the farmers and not to the retailers, then I think there is a possibility, just like organic has been possible for a very large number of farmers in, for example, Wisconsin. But I agree, that's...
I just feel like that'd be the opposite of like Walmart, which was up there. Like this would be like the CSAs and the tiny farmers that are doing it on their homesteads.
But if we're trying to move to more than 1% of the population, then dealing with the big purchasers of food who deal with 25% of the food supply seem like a place to start.
Yes.
I guess one more, and then I think time's stopped. Go ahead.
On the strips method of farming that you showed, are the strips that are prairie, do those stay prairie for years and years, or do you alternate prairie with crops?
You know, it's a relatively new method, and I think they've done it both ways, and I actually don't know whether one has been shown to be more effective than the other. I know that for some of them, they leave them in prairie, and they just plant the corn around them, which is kind of cool. And it's apparently very easy to do, but that is the plan, to keep them in as perennial crops so that they're transporting so many nutrients down to their roots for the winter. Yes.
Do you think instead of planting prairie plants, we could use biochar and then add it to the soil, assuming that we have got a a plant where we got a processing facility for biochar
Mm-hmm.
in the radius of 50 miles, and then add it to the soil.
Absolutely. Biochar is one of the more effective ways to enhance soil carbon and soil health. Yes? Biochar is like charcoal. So it's biological material that has been put in a very, very hot oven and charred. And it's a great way of storing carbon in the soil. It doesn't add to the soil health the way live plants will. But it is a great way to store carbon and keep it from going off into the atmosphere because it's a very, very stable form of carbon. The problem is that biochar plants are not accessible to all farmers. And it may not be financially feasible to transport biochar to long distances, whereas any farmer can plant perennial plants in their farm. Yes?
When you showed the picture of Iowa farms where there were blank spots with no topsoil, what's the mechanism for putting topsoil or creating topsoil for those areas that are already devastated?
Planting plants that require less soil. So, for example, if you've ever seen a volcano, right after the volcano cools, you basically have rock there, and there are a few species of plants, legumes for the most part, that will colonize that rock and begin to bring biological material back in. And the same thing can be done with very, very hardy plants, not crop plants necessarily, but very hardy plants that can be cropped in those bare areas. The scary part is that 25%, I just heard this last week from one of my colleagues at Iowa State, 25% of Iowa land is thought to be devoid of topsoil now, today. So one of the advantages we have where it's a mosaic and you have just spots is that the rich parts of the soil that remain will eventually begin to help out the parts that are devoid of topsoil. But if you're talking 25% of the landmass of a state the size of Iowa, that starts becoming a really daunting problem.
Isn't Iowa then a really great place? And because they're in a crisis mode, I would suspect.
You would think so.
So that would be a mechanisms. We have a crisis, we have a solution.
Yep. And the people who developed strips are training farmers across the state of Iowa to implement it, and it's still a pretty small proportion. I think they're at maybe between 10 and 20% of the farms doing strip cropping. So, yeah.
So how's Wisconsin doing with its dairy, the lower two-thirds with alfalfa part of the rotation compared to, say, Iowa?
My understanding is we're better, but what I don't know is how much of that is due to the amount of slope, because that's a critical feature with soil erosion, and how much is due to the fact that we have dairy, alfalfa is part of our rotations, and we also bring a lot of manure into the soil, which also increases the organic matter. But yeah, we are definitely in better shape than Iowa, but there are many parts of Wisconsin where you can see the same kind of phenomenon.
Have we got pictures of Wisconsin, like the bald spots?
I am actually trying to get those. So I had to wait until after plowing because as long as there are plants there, it's kind of obscured. But I'm actually working with some drone owners to see if we can get some photographs of the right land.
Another question or two?
I'm wondering if switchgrass could be, I know that's been investigated as a commercial.
Mm-hmm.
It's perennial, so.
Yep.
Could take maybe a corn or something like that. I don't know. Is that?
I don't think it's ever going to make a great feed for cows the way corn is, but it certainly is a great replacement from a soil standpoint, and for other uses like using it for fermentation and biomaterials. Yes.
Are the costs for startup with farming comparable when you're going for safe soil to traditional farming as it is now? So if you're starting with a new farmer and he says, okay, I don't have any vested interests at this point. If I go into safe soil, startup costs are about the same? Or
Yes.
So
Yes,
close
it's
for a bit.
right.
And then the profit potential is higher.
Is much higher because within 2 to 3 years, the fertilizer need drops pretty substantially, and so the input costs are lower, but the yields stay the same. Oh,
Got one more here.
oh, sorry.
One question. So, I don't know much about this, but do keystone species exist in the microbial community? So, like, as far as rebuilding the soil, is there certain like, bacteria or stuff that are essentially essential for the microbial communities that can target first?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's the other talk I didn't give. But we're trying to understand microbial communities better so that we have answers like that. We think that there's enormous redundancy in microbial communities, and that means that it may be one species or another one that does equivalent kinds of things would be sufficient. But we don't have a good enough sense of which species those are to be able to target them yet.
I would assume that the other, like eroded soils also have increased diversity though.
Yeah.
So does that also mean that their ability to repair or replenish themselves is like reduced?
Yes, yes, they do have lower diversity. The typical rule in microbial communities is that healthier communities are more diverse, and when they become degraded and less healthy and less functional, they typically have much lower diversity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.